Ambassador McFaul, thank you very much for your time. Let's start with the McFaul Group. You've been working with the Office of the President of Ukraine on imposing sanctions against Russian proxies and those who support the Kremlin in its invasion of Ukraine. Currently, your primary target is Russian propagandists and opinion leaders. What is the final goal here?
Well, so first let me clarify what we do and what we informally do, right? So the group that I coordinate is an international working group that tries to come up with new ideas, to suggest ideas for governments for new sanctions. We coordinate with with the Ukrainian government, Mr. Yermak, but I want to emphasize that our group is independent from the government of Ukraine, independent from the United States government. Again, we talk to everybody, but our ideas ultimately are just independent analysts. None of us work for any government. Ultimately, we come up with ideas that we then can only be implemented by governments, right? Sanctions or by companies, by the way. We sometimes, the target of our activities are aimed at trying to get companies to rethink what they're doing. The latest paper that we just put out, it's an appendix to working paper number 3 that you just noted, is to give greater attention to what we call the propagandists for Putin's war. These are not just people on TV supporting the war, but these can be a variety of kinds of people, soft power, as we call it in English, right, that are indirectly supporting Putin's regime and Putin's war. And we believe that there needs to be more attention to these people, that they are not innocents, that if they are performing concerts in support of the Russian military, especially if they do so in annexed in territory that the Russians are illegally occupying, they should pay some consequences for those activities.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were trying to convince the US government to recognize Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. President Biden said that he would not go ahead with this, and my sources at the White House explained to me that this label could be compared to, a huge blanket that you can put on Russia, but it's barely impossible to take it off. And it would make, for instance, the grain deal impossible. So is it a done deal for you, or is there still a chance that the US will recognize Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism at some point?
I don't know the answer to your question. We did publish a paper about that. We believe that the actions that the Russian government is taking inside Ukraine are terrorist acts. They are terrorizing non-combatants. And I'm not a lawyer, but I looked at the language of that law very, very closely. And it's difficult to say in a normative way that what Russia is doing somehow in Ukraine is not terrorism. And I just remind your viewers, Cuba is on the list. So tell me, is Cuba terrorizing people in a different country to a greater extent than Russia is inside Ukraine? My answer to that is no. So I think that's a very difficult argument for people to make, that Russia somehow is a better international actor with regard to terrorism than Cuba is today. Cuba is still on the list. Now, I know those arguments from the White House. I have colleagues who work in the White House. I understand their concerns, that they think sanctions will be sticky, and that you can't do certain cooperation with Russia if they're a state sponsor of terrorism. But actually, the law gives the president the right to do certain things within the law to grant exemptions. So it's not true that we can't work with them. I would remind your viewers that Iran is on that list, and yet we negotiated with Iranian diplomats the JCPOA. It didn't prevent us from sitting down and talking to them about that. That was a large, major agreement. So I think there are ways to move forward if they wanted to. And I want to be clear. I appreciate why the Biden administration is nervous about this step. I just think the outrageous behavior of Russians inside Ukraine, these are terrorist acts from the way I look at them, demands that we do something different. And I would say in general, I don't like the dynamics of sanctions where it's always incrementalism. It's always just a little bit more, a few more people here, a few more people there. when I don't see what Putin is doing inside Ukraine as being incremental. He just annexed on paper, not in reality, territory the size of Portugal. That's outrageous behavior. And so we need to have a commensurate response to that outrageous behavior, not an incremental response.
What would this comprehensive response look like? What would it look like? What is your solution here?
Well, read our papers. We've been very explicit. The paper about state sponsor of terrorism talks very explicitly about if you wanted to go further, what you could do. And that's the blanket part that the administration doesn't like is exactly the part that I like. That it means you have to do all these things, that your hands are tied, that you're not, choosing which oligarch is good and which oligarch is bad. That you're actually, you're doing blanket things that tie your hands, like our paper on individual sanctions that we published as well. We want thousands of Russians that are enabling Putin's war machine inside Ukraine to be sanctioned. But we also give them a choice, by the way, which I think is another innovative thing. Rather than, once you're on the sanctions list, it's very difficult to get off. It's almost impossible to get off of the list. We frame it in a different way. We sanction, first of all, we say all Russian oligarchs. We don't like this picking and choosing. Why some are on the list and some are not, I think is very difficult to justify. And it leads to a lot of speculation about, why are some getting special deals and others are not. So we just say put them all on the list, all 200 on the Forbes list, and then have them take actions to say, I renounce the war. I want to support Ukrainian reconstruction. And then that gives them a chance to get off the list. Same with government officials. We say all of these people, if you are in these jobs, you should be on the sanctions list. We're not going to discriminate between, the governor of this region versus the governor of that region. Just put them all on the list. And then if you want to get off the list, resign from your post. So that gives you agency about your status. Same with people that serve on boards of companies, Russian companies, including non-Russians. If you're on the list, we want to sanction everybody on those boards, but then you can choose to resign to get your name off the sanctions list. And by the way, some have. Some Americans have, some Russians have, and I applaud their decision to do that. In return, then they should be released from those sanctions lists.
So at this point, we're talking about the presumption of guilt at some point, right?
Well, first, let me clarify. I don't like your metaphor, the presumption of guilt. We're not talking about criminal procedures here. And so, we're not talking about a court of law in the United States. I think it's very important to disaggregate that. Nobody has the right to visit the United States of America. I used to have this argument with Mr. Lavrov when we did the Magnitsky Act, and he said, this is violating their rights. And I was like, Mr. Lavrov, your people are not citizens of the United States of America. They don't have a right to go to Disneyland. That's a privilege to go to Disneyland. So let's just remember, what's legal versus what sovereign countries have the right to do. And I say this because there's a big debate in Europe, as you know, about visas for Russians to travel in those countries. I have a very particular view on that if you're interested, but I also respect the sovereignty rights of individual countries to make those decisions. Russians don't have a right to vacation on the Italian Riviera. That's a privilege. But second, you've alluded to a very important point. I actually think the mechanics, the infrastructure for both enforcing sanctions needs to be stronger, but also to not do collateral damage as a result of sanctions to people that are not supporting Putin's regime. So the worst case is when Russians leave Russia for political reasons, and they can't find a country that will take them. They cannot use their credit cards because their credit cards have been swept up in sanctions. And again, those are companies that made those decisions, right? Visa and MasterCard. Those are companies that made those decisions, not the White House, not the European Union. And yet those individuals are being swept up into that. Independent media companies that I can't talk about the details, but I know about them, where as a result of sanctions, they're having their licenses, come under question that are done, that are registered in Western democracies. And those, to me, are unintended negative consequences of the way sanctions are being implemented right now. And I think it should be adjusted. And I personally believe that this is my personal belief, and many people in Ukraine do not agree with me. I want to make that clear. We have not published a paper, for instance, about this. But I think there should be a mechanism for people to get off the sanctions list if they agree to denounce Putin and denounce his war and to contribute a portion of their wealth to Ukrainian reconstruction. That's my personal idea as a way to get off the list. I also, and this is again my personal idea that many people do not support. I think with regard to individual visas for Russians to travel to democracies, I don't like blanket sanctions against all Russians because I know that all Russians don't support Putin's war. Right? I have friends that don't. I have friends in jail in Russia that I know don't support Putin's war, right? So I wouldn't want Mr. Yashin or Mr. Karamurza or Mr. Navalny, so if they one day got out of jail, would travel to a country in Europe and would be denied entry because they're Russians. That seems to me rather absurd. But I do think it's equally absurd to put the burden on all these countries to accept all Russians coming, the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands by now, whereby we don't know if those Russians support the war or not. And by the way, a handful of those Russians, of course, will be intelligence agents. Let's just be honest. I know Putin's intelligence services rather well. There's no doubt in my mind that some of them will be intelligence officers disguised as anti-war protesters. So my solution is two things. One, have them all sign a declaration when they show up in Kazakhstan or Georgia or somewhere else to say, I do not support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I do not support Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And two, have them all pay what I call a reconstruction tax. That 100 euros. I don't know what it would be. It would not, but some kind of additional payment for their visa that shows in a very credible way that they support the Ukrainian side in this war. Because Putin says that the Western countries are the enemies. So what are you doing showing up in enemy territory if you're still supporting Mr. Putin? You have to demonstrate that you do not support the war.
So far, the United States has allocated more than $60 billion to support Kyiv. So talk to me about the U.S. national interest in helping Ukraine.
Well, I think there's two categories of interests. I do believe that the United States is a democracy, that we have made certain mistakes in our past. I'm happy to talk about them, especially with the use of military force. But we don't support imperialism. We don't support colonization. We don't support annexation. We don't support terrorism in terms of our moral stances in the world. And therefore, I think we have a moral interest, and I say this as an American myself. I'm against imperialism. I'm for democracy. I'm against terrorism. And so I want my elected leaders to be for those moral positions as well. And in this case, in this war, it's a dictatorship that has invaded a democracy. It is an imperial power that is trying to recolonize a former colony. And it is a country using indiscriminate force, terrorist acts against non-combatants. And I think for moral reasons, therefore, we must support the Ukrainians in their fight for their sovereignty, their fight for their democracy, and their fight against these barbaric actions against innocent civilians inside Ukraine. I also think there are concrete American national security interests at stake here as well. So those are two different things. If Ukraine wins this war, it will be reassuring for our NATO allies. It will be comforting for the rest of the world that worries about Russian aggression. Ukraine's not the only country in the world that worries about that. And I believe that it would be a good signal for other countries thinking of using force. I have in mind China in particular. I was just in Taiwan a few weeks ago, and nobody is cheering for the Ukrainians to win more than the Taiwanese, as a signal to China to not take that kind of military action. And these are all things that are in America's national security interests. I also think it would be a signal to the world that democracy is back on the march. Democracy, the democratic world, has not had a very good several years. We've been in an era of democratic decline for 15 years. Ukraine's victory there would be good for us all. Conversely, a win for Putin in Ukraine would make our allies nervous, and we'll have to spend more money, and we'll probably have to deploy more American soldiers to those frontline NATO states to reassure them. The fence sitters around the world in the global south will think, okay, maybe America really is in decline, like Xi Jinping and Putin argue. And I think it would embolden Xi Jinping when thinking about using force against Taiwan. And that will be a catastrophic event for American national security interests. We will be in a very, very difficult set of decisions about what we are going to do if, God forbid, Xi Jinping would make the decision to try to invade Taiwan. So I think there are big moral reasons at stake here, and there are big national security interests at stake here.
Ambassador, sooner or later this war will be over, and I've heard a myriad of opinions on what's going to happen to Russia after this, and some say that it may lead to Russia's collapse as it happened to the USSR. Does this scenario look realistic to you, and how will the US react to this, should it happen?
Well, again, political scientists aren't very good about predicting the future. By the way, neither is the CIA. I worked in the government for 5 years, and they missed a lot of things too when I was there. So I'm hesitant to answer your question. With that caveat in mind, I would say a couple of things. One, I do not believe that this war will lead to the collapse of the Russian Federation in the same way that the invasion of Afghanistan by Leonid Brezhnev was one of the precipitants that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I say that because the balance of power between the ethnic republics and Russia the rest of Russia is different than the Soviet Union. I say that because a lot of the leaders in the ethnic republics are some of the most loyal people that support Moscow and support Putin. So I'm not in the category that thinks this will lead to the dissolution of the Russian Federation. I am in the category of people, however, that believe that this is the beginning of the end of Putinism as a political regime and as a political ideology. I don't think it'll happen while Putin's alive and in power. I think he'll be in power for a long time. I don't see that happening. But at the end of Putin's reign, whenever that happens, and I'm not a doctor, that's more a question for a doctor than a political analyst. But whenever he is no longer able to rule Russia, I think that will be the moment of questioning about whether this was a wise thing to do and where we go in the future for Russians. And right now, I don't know of a single economic elite that thinks this war was in Russia's national interest. They have to be quiet. They can't say that publicly. But this has been a disaster for any major economic elite inside Russia. Russian generals, is this a good thing for them? Absolutely not. This has been a disaster for them. And I think there'll be a big blame game between them and this, the intelligence officers, the FSB people that drag them into this war with bad intelligence. I think there'll be real tension between those groups. Third, Russian society. Yes, they're adamant, fervent supporters of Putin's war. But if you look at the opinion poll data, the group that is least supportive of Putin's war are the young, the educated, the urban, and the rich. It's very clear cut, and those numbers are as big as the fervent supporters of the war. Then there's the bolota in the middle, right? Then there's the 60% that kind of support the war, but they don't really think about politics, who are now mobilized because of mobilization. The war has finally come to them. But the support, the anti-war group are just going to grow over time, right? Because the younger people are going to get older, and the older people, the over 65, the over 55 that support Putin, over time, that group is going to become smaller. And then I would just remind people that there are people doing incredibly brave acts. Some are in jail. Some have had to flee their country because they are so fervently against the war. And I don't think those people are going away. They're not going to quit. They're going to keep fighting for a different kind of Russia. And again, I don't want to pretend to predict the future. We're talking about years in the future, maybe decades. But the idea that Russia will be permanently against the West, will be permanently acting as an imperial country, I just think that's a premature prediction.
And the last question, I've seen your multiple tweets where you were trying to address the Russian people, even in Russian, trying to say something like «Россияне, опомнитесь, вы должны бороться за свою свободу». And at this point, if you had a chance like to talk to those who support Putinism and Putin's war against Ukraine, what would you tell them?
Well, I would say first, this war, a war of choice by Putin, a senseless war, not provoked by any threat to Russia. The absurdity that Ukraine was somehow threatening mighty Russia, or that NATO was threatening mighty Russia, is complete nonsense. It is a senseless war, a tragic war that Ukrainians first and foremost are suffering, but Russians are in the second category of people that are suffering as a result of this horrific war. I hope someday that they understand that there's no advantage to Russia over imperial conquest. Russia's a big country. Why do they need Kherson? They have the largest country in the world. They should devote their energies and resources to developing the territories that they have, rather than conquering new territories. And the sooner that they understand that, the better it will be, for all of Russians. I have two sons. I can't imagine sending my sons to a war with no purpose, to die for no purpose. I admire greatly what Russians, and by the way, Ukrainians and Estonians and Latvians and Georgians did to fight a truly imperial fascistic regime that saved the free world in 1945. And when you're attacked, you must fight. That was a war of purpose. This is a war with no purpose. I would hate to be the mother of the last son that dies in this senseless war. Better to end it now than years down the road when those sons will just keep dying and dying in Ukraine. We know, as you implied, this war is going to end. It'll end in some kind of negotiation. It will not end in the unification of Ukraine and Russia. So why not just end it sooner rather than later?
Ambassador McFaul, thank you very much for this interview.